What is going on, everybody? It is the Stokastic MLB Strategy Show. We are sponsored by PrizePicks today. Like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. We got a lot going on this slate. We've got some pitching options to talk about, and then, of course, Field is back in our lives. Already got Sean V talking about in the YouTube chat here. Dodgers always suck the first game in Coors. Deacon 2, the legend, saying the last time the Dodgers were in Coors, I don't know, they disappointed every night, which is true, actually. If you remember that last series, Adam, I think it was pretty routine. We saw the Dodgers projected for kind of similar ownership to what they have tonight, that like mid 30% range, and they laid a bunch of stinkers, and they're drawing another matchup against Jose Urena tonight. So that's going to bring up some talking points. How you doing, Adam?
Doing pretty well. Had a good day yesterday. Hopefully carry that over to today.
Yeah, Adam has been on a bit of a heater, not just one slate either. I think there was last week back-to-back slates and morning afternoon slate where he took second on both of them. And then you've had a bunch of big hits recently as well. So Adam running hot, and we'll see how he's handling Coors Field today. I'm definitely going to be taking some notes as he talks through the slate. And I didn't check if there's any weather concerns or not today. Not that we usually talk too much about them this early in the morning. But yeah, this looks like another slate where, for me personally, we're going to have to contemplate what to do with all of the ownership that's going to the Dodgers here in Coors Field against Jose Urena. We'll be talking about that game in a little bit, but starting us off here, the Kansas City Royals against the New York Yankees. Brady Singer on the mound for KC. He's been solid this year, 3.76 expected ERA, 25.5% K rate. He's obviously taking on a very difficult offense in the New York Yankees. One thing that stands out to me about this spot, Adam, is because there is so much ownership going to the Dodgers at Coors Field in that matchup against Jose Urena and their massive high 7 implied team total. There's a lot of other teams coming in very low owned. So I don't think Brady Singer is terrible. I think he's pretty solid. But on a smallish slate with 8 games where the Yankees are only picking up 2% ownership, that's pretty appealing to me.
Yeah, I agree. This is one spot where I think maybe you see that ownership come up at least a little bit throughout the day. But at the same time, they are expensive. And it's not only that you have the Dodgers, like obviously they're pulling a ton of ownership, but you also have the Blue Jays in a favorable spot. Cleveland's getting some ownership because they're cheap. So I think that you do probably see the Yankees ownership higher than 2.5%. But at the same time, I don't think it's the type of situation like we had the last time the Dodgers were in Coors, where it was basically like the Dodgers and the Braves were the clear top 2 stacks, and the Braves just weren't projected for any ownership, and they ended up getting like equal ownership. There's enough other teams up there to pull away non-Dodgers ownership that I do think the Yankees do come in relatively low owned, especially because they're expensive as well. And like you said, Singer, not a bad pitcher. I mean, this is a former first-round pick. Pedigree is there. 104 expected ISO to right-handed hitters since debuting in the major leagues. So far this year, sub 100 expected ISO to righties with a 23% strikeout percentage. He's had issues with left-handed power, 237 expected ISO, but he's also struck out lefties at a 28% clip. And it's not like the Yankees have a ton of left-handed power. You have Rizzo, you have Carpenter. If Benintendi's playing today, you have him in the lineup, but you're talking about a predominantly right-handed lineup. So I don't think it's a great matchup for the Yankees, but the Yankees are also pretty close to matchup proof when you consider how much power is in this lineup.
And it is funny you bring up Benintendi, because I have one thing about him in the back of my head, which is typically when players get traded, it takes a little bit of time for them to get into the lineup. But the Yankees are playing a series against the Royals, so I figure he's already there, which does make him way more likely to play in this game than he otherwise would be. So I'm kind of half expecting that Benintendi is going to be in the Yankees lineup today. But when it comes to Singer, considering that he's only 1% owned, is there any interest in him for large field tournaments?
A little bit in large field tournaments. I think this is a kind of tricky pitching slate. You have what I consider to be 3 clear top options, and then a couple other like solid mid-range options in Kikuchi and Tyon. I think the top 3 are Otani, Wheeler, and Wood. But after that, it's like either the good pitchers have bad matchups, or you're talking about a pitcher that just isn't very good. And so I do think that 8K Singer is going under-owned, but I do also think he's a pretty low probability play. We have him with a 10% chance of being a top 2 pitcher. I personally have him at 8%. But either way, talking about 1% ownership, that's a spot where in any given lineup, you can use him to be contrarian, but it's just not somebody I expect to get a lot of.
Yeah, I don't know that he'll make it into my lineups. And a lot of this also could depend on what I end up doing with Coors Field later on the day. I assume I'm probably going to end up being way underweight to it. But if I do end up making Coors stacks, Brady Singer is one of those pitchers that could differentiate the lineup, because it's going to be hard to play any kind of Dodger stack that's going to be differentiated from an offense point of view. So you'd have to do with the pitching. That's where you get a 1% on Brady Singer, where it's like, hey, if I roster him, who really cares what the ownership is at offense? So that's where I think his utility would come into play. On the other side of the game, Jamison Tyon's pitching for the Yankees. He's been solid this year, but not as much from a fantasy perspective because he's a sub 20% K rate. But now he is going up against a Royals offense that's not only not been great for the year, but is now also missing Andrew Benintendi, who is one of the few serviceable hitters at the top of their order. And it, I assume they're going to be trading even more guys in the next coming days, and it's going to be a really shitty lineup moving forward. So when it comes to Tyon, I know he's $8,600 over on DK. FanDuel, we've got Tyon priced at $9,300. That's a pretty steep price point. But is he somebody that catches your interest at all just because the Kansas City lineup is starting to get weaker?
Yeah, I kind of mentioned him a second ago as one of the like 5 pitchers that are getting ownership on this slate. He's not a huge priority for me. Again, I think that Otani, Wheeler, and Wood are really the guys, but it is a good matchup for Tyon. Like you said, Benintendi not on Kansas City anymore. Salvador Perez has been injured. I agree with your point as well. By the time the trade deadline rolls around, this Kansas City team is probably going to look like the Kansas City team that was playing in Toronto without half of their guys, because they're going to end up trading everybody. You basically have Melendez, Merrifield, Pasquantino, and then just absolute garbage throughout the rest of this lineup. Jamison Tyon, not a great strikeout pitcher, but he's not a bad pitcher overall. Only a 19.7% strikeout percentage this year, but a 3.83 xFIP, and obviously just more talented than most of this Kansas City lineup. So I do think he's a solid SP2 option today.
Yeah, and then one other thing that's kind of weird about this spot is the Royals are picking up a little bit of ownership, 4% owned as a team. That's pretty unappealing to me. We have them with the third lowest top stack odds on the slate, and the only teams below them, it's the Rangers against Shohei Ohtani, and then the Pirates against Zach Wheeler. Pretty hard for me to back the Royals when they're actually picking up ownership.
Yeah, it's tough for me to get there as well. Individually, Vinny Pasquantino, I think, looks good at 2,300. You have the short porch in Yankee Stadium. He has looked very good so far in the majors, at least plate discipline and approach wise. He's regarded as a very good hitting prospect. He has the platoon advantage against Tyon. So individually, I think he looks good. Merrifield is always reasonable. Melendez is pretty much always reasonable, but he is relatively expensive. But Pasquantino in particular, I think, looks very good.
Yeah, that's where there are some individual hitters we could use as one-offs, but not really that much interest in stacking the team. By the way, if you guys want to get access to all the tools we have at the site, like stuff like the top pitchers tool, top stacks tool, I love the top stacks tool. It gives us the percentage odds of each individual team to be the top scoring team of the day, and also compares that to what the team's projected ownership is going to be. So you want access to all that and all the other tools we have to offer for basically every single DFS sport out there. What you're going to want to do is sign up for a Stokastic Plus Platinum Pass and use the promo code MLB Strategy Show when you're signing up for the first time. That's MLB Strategy Show, all one word, all capital letters, because it's going to get you 50% off your first week of a Platinum Pass. Stop guessing, start winning, join Stokastic Plus today. So moving on to the next game, and this is one of the better pitching options we have on the slate. Zach Wheeler, 2.86 expected ERA. The K rate, 27.7%. So another really strong year for Zach Wheeler. He also tends to work deeper into ball games than the majority of pitchers do. And he draws a matchup against the Pittsburgh Pirates, who, despite calling up a lot of their top prospects, it hasn't really improved the offense all that much. O'Neal Cruz, he's had his struggles this year. And then also guys like Ke'Bryan Hayes have not quite panned out at the plate. So as a result, I think Zach Wheeler is very difficult to avoid on this slate in terms of his current projected ownership. Seems a little low to me. Projected for under 30% ownership over on DK. FanDuel only projected for 15% ownership, with everybody flocking to roster Shohei Ohtani. I think Wheeler's going a little bit underlooked in the spot. He's going to be expensive, but I don't really find pricing generally to be that much of an issue on DK as of late. So 10-2 for Zach Wheeler. It's sub 30% ownership. Sign me up.
Yeah, I think he looks good. The one thing I will say about the ownership is when I first looked at this slate and kind of just like put together my dummy lineup by hand, I was just like, oh, the obvious pitching is Wheeler or Ohtani. And then as I started finishing out the rest of the lineup, I realized that it was actually pretty difficult to get to the Dodgers, at least the Dodgers that I would want. That's one difference today between this slate and last time the Dodgers were in Coors is DraftKings did actually give most of them reasonable prices. And so then when I did my first crunch with like actual projections, I was actually getting Wood and Ohtani as like my cash game pitchers and stuff like that. So I was surprised because obviously it's a really, really good spot for Wheeler, but it really just comes down to the bats that you're able to get to if you do go down to Alex Wood as your SP2 instead of going with the Wheeler Ohtani pairing. So I do think a lot of my Wheeler I think my overall Wheeler exposure will be in part dependent on how much of course I get to. Like if I end up playing a lot of the Dodgers, then I'm gonna have more trouble getting to Wheeler, and it's probably gonna drive me to be getting to more of the Kikuchi, Tyon, and then just random low owned pitchers. Whereas if I'm going to cheaper teams, and that goes for teams like the Yankees too that are expensive. Whereas if I'm going to cheaper teams, then that's gonna allow me to get to more Wheeler.
Yeah, I think that totally makes sense. And a lot of that also is going to depend on the ownership for me. For me personally, where we currently have the Dodgers projected at 34% ownership as a team, it's probably going to be a little bit too steep for me to want to get there in any kind of crazy bulk or be overweight to the field. But we still got a lot of time to go. A lot of time for things to change, ownership to change later on the day, and lineups to come out. But on the other side of the game, Zach Thompson is starting for the Pirates, and he's had his struggles this year. Expected ERA north of 5, not generating swing and misses, only a 14.4% K rate. So we've got this Philadelphia Phillies team that's actually picking up a little bit of ownership. Not like too high or anything like that, but we do have them with 7% ownership share, 6% chance to be a top stack. How do you like the Philadelphia Phillies as a stack? It is a park downgrade for them.
Yeah, park downgrade for the Phillies, but I do think that they're interesting in tournaments just because there is still some power in this lineup, and they're not the Dodgers, they're not the Blue Jays, they're not the Guardians, so they're just not going to be one of the highest owned teams. Right now, they're projected for about 7% aggregate ownership, 6% chance of being the top stack. Individually, Kyle Schwarber looks very good at 5,100. The price tag on Derek Hall is solid at 3,600. It does suck that Hall and Hoskins play the same position, but this team overall is pretty inexpensive as well. Schwarber's the only guy above 5K. Hall, I mentioned at 3,600, but you have Castellanos at 3,900, Bryson Stott at 2,900. So it is a park downgrade, but I do have some interest in the Phillies at what I expect to be moderate ownership.
Yeah, especially if you're playing in stuff like single entry or three max entry, because that's where I think we really see the Dodgers ownership get crazy inflated. And I really think if you're playing in those kinds of fields, if you're somebody who hand builds, plays one lineup, if you're playing anybody other than the Dodgers as a stack in single entry, you're going to be massively contrarian. They're going to be a very popular single entry team. And I think somebody like the Phillies would certainly make sense in that situation, especially when you look at how much Zach Thompson has struggled this year. Any interest in the Pirates on the other side of this game as an offense?
No.
All right, we are on the same page with that. Next game, Toronto Blue Jays, Detroit Tigers. Yusei Kikuchi, his numbers this year indicate there's some fantasy upside, mostly because he's a 25.1% K rate. But 6.26 expected ERA, 1.57 whip. Last I looked, I believe he is last amongst all pitchers in wins above replacement this year because he's been fairly terrible from a real life standpoint. But from a fantasy side, we always have to kind of give some consideration to the fact that he generates a lot of strikeouts. He's a not so difficult matchup against the Detroit Tigers, even though the Tigers have been better against left-hand pitching than right-hand pitching this year. But where do you stand on Kikuchi and his strikeout rate as being a potential contrarian option to save money with in tournaments?
I think both sides of this are actually pretty interesting from a tournament standpoint. Kikuchi at 7,700 certainly gives you upside. You can say what you want about him as a pitcher overall. He has a 25% strikeout percentage, which on this slate is behind Ohtani, Wheeler, Singer, Crawford. That's it. So the strikeout upside clearly is there. And then you talk about the Detroit matchup, which, yeah, they have a lot of right-handed bats, but overall they're still not particularly good hitters. And even against righties this year, actually, Kikuchi has a much higher strikeout percentage against righties at 26.5% compared to 19.6% against lefties. So the strikeout upside's clearly there. It's also risky because he's allowed a 218 expected ISO to righties. Overall this year, he's allowed nearly 2 home runs per 9 innings. His xFIP is better than his ERA, slightly at 4.48. So it's a spot where it's never surprising if you say Kikuchi struggles. He's also walked like 13.5% of hitters this year, which is a good way to get in trouble really quickly. But you can't ignore that he has one of the highest strikeout percentages on the slate. He's facing the Tigers at $7,700.
Yeah, and by the way, very, very important question answer. Mike Campbell asked, did Eric enjoy his 40th birthday yesterday? Based on the text message he sent me last night, I'm not sure he enjoyed it as much as I thought he was going to. He did apparently get hundreds of DMs yesterday, which I thought was very funny.
That's amazing.
So thank you guys for supporting Eric in his birthday. But no, I don't know why. He seemed upset about something when it came to his birthday yesterday. So I agree with you. I think we have to consider both sides of this in large field tournaments, mostly because there's obvious upside in both sides. If Kikuchi is decent, it has to be via strikeouts. He gives up a lot of hard contact when he gets hit. But at the same time, too, the Tigers, kind of like what we saw against Minaya the other day, they can get to left-hand pitching. They're a better offense against lefties than righties. So nothing is a priority for me in this game, but I think both sides have upside in tournaments and are worth getting to. We do have the Tigers with the second best value odds in our top stacks pool today. And then if you look at a pitcher like Kikuchi, he has 12% chance to be a top two value pitcher. He's actually more popular than I realized. He is actually projected for 25% ownership, which makes him the fourth most popular pitcher on the slate. I didn't think he was going to be that popular today when I first looked at this slate.
Yeah, I didn't think it would be that high, but I did think he'd be one of the guys getting ownership because kind of like I had said before, like there's most pitchers on this slate are either bad or in really unappealing spots. Like Logan Gilbert's good, but he's facing Houston. Tyler Anderson's good, but he's pitching in Colorado. Justin Steele is solid, and I think we'll talk about him, a reasonable play, but like also not the best matchup against San Francisco. Tristan McKenzie's super expensive. So Kikuchi is just one of the guys that stands out as like moderately priced, moderately talented, and in a good enough matchup.
Yeah, that all follows for me. And then on the other side, Detroit, Tyler Alexander's on the mound, and he is no fantasy appeal at all with a 12.9% K rate. The Toronto Blue Jays as an offense, they're picking up some ownership, but we do have them right now with the second best top stack odds on the slate. There's tiers to the offenses today. The Dodgers are well above everybody else in terms of top stack odds. But then Toronto, with a slightly over 10% chance to be the next highest scoring team, they're also on an island in terms of their own. They're going to be a little bit expensive, which does seem to be something that's driving down their ownership. But I think this is an offense that's going overlooked a little bit today.
The Blue Jays or the Tigers?
The Blue Jays.
Okay, yeah. I mean, maybe a little bit overlooked. I can get on board with that. I think the ownership's more or less probably where it should be. It is a solid matchup for them, and they are also just another team that is kind of matchup proof because they have so much power in this lineup. Tyler Alexander this year, 210 expected ISO to righties, only a 13.8% strikeout percentage. You have tons and tons of right-handed power in this lineup for Toronto. So it certainly looks like a good spot for them.
Yeah. And I mean, not too much else to add. Like if you're playing cash games, the focus is going to be the Los Angeles Dodgers bats. But in tournaments, if you're looking to get off some of the Dodgers chalk, I think the Blue Jays are one of the teams that makes sense as a potential pivot.
One potential negative for Toronto, and it's a difficult one to quantify, but Alexander's probably not going more than a few innings. So there's a good chance that most of this lineup is only going to see him once, maybe twice. So it's still like an overall good spot for Toronto, but that is just something to keep in mind that it's kind of a bullpen game.
Yeah, let me look at what are the numbers for Detroit's bullpen this year. Do you have those numbers in front of you or
no? Off the top of my head, I want to say that they're pretty average because I remember the other day somebody in chat on a show with me and Josh saying Detroit's bullpen was like great, and Josh pulled it up and was like, "What the hell are you talking about?"
Yeah, so 3.07 ERA, 3.26 FIP for them. It's pretty good numbers. The xFIP is a little bit lower because the home run and fly ball rate's only 5.6%, but yeah, it does seem like the bullpen has been solid. So maybe I will have to downgrade the Detroit Tigers a little bit. How deep has Alexander gone in his recent outings?
Like 40-ish pitches.
All right. Yeah, probably that's a good point by you. That's probably more of a concern than I was thinking about coming into this. So that does make me think the ownership for the Blue Jays is probably more appropriate than anything. Last outing for Alexander, 3 innings, 40-ish pitches there, 1 inning, 3 1/3. So yeah, we're probably getting 3-4 innings most from Tyler Alexander than a bullpen game. So yeah, I think everything you say there makes sense. Good points. I would probably make the Blue Jays less of a priority than they would have been a few minutes ago, which is what I like.
And also and obviously you're aware of this, but like the reason it's difficult to quantify too, you can look at what a team's bullpen is doing, but that's also typically going to be skewed pretty heavily by like how good the back end of your bullpen is. And that's not what we're talking about when somebody comes in the 4th inning either.
Yeah. But still, the bullpen figures to be better than Tyler Alexander.
Right. Yeah. Bullpen games in general are not typically appealing, regardless of what bullpen we're talking about, because you're just seeing a different arm every time you come up to hit. And these days, even in bad bullpens, everybody's throwing 100 miles an hour. It's just that bad bullpens might walk you more often.
Yeah. No, all good information. That's what I like doing the shows with you or whoever else I might be that I'm doing strategy shows with, because we come in the morning. I haven't put that much thought into the slate. I wake up, I look at some of the stats, I put the run sheet together. It's not like I built my lineups, 8 hours or so before the slate starts. We talk through it, and information like that is stuff that I just hadn't thought of at this point in the day, and it's valuable information to have. So Moving on to the next game here, Cleveland Guardians, Boston Red Sox. Got a couple of young pitchers here that I do think have a little bit of upside. Tristan McKenzie, he's pitched better as of late. He's a 3.98 expected ERA, 23.9% K rate. Cutter Crawford really never gets very many looks from the field. He's almost always a contrarian pitching option. Low-key been good, 3.95 expected ERA, 27% K rate. So this is a game with another fairly high total at 9 runs, and it looks like the offenses are going to be picking up some ownership. The Red Sox projected for 5% ownership. The Guardians projected for nearly 12% ownership against Cutter Crawford. I think these pitchers are better than what the field is giving them credit for.
Yeah, I think both pitchers from a DFS standpoint are pretty similar too, in that Crawford's certainly not a priority for me. It's a really difficult strikeout matchup. But like you said, he has shown good strikeout stuff, 25.2% strikeout percentage as a starter this year, 3.7 xFIP. On the other side, McKenzie has a 24% strikeout percentage, 4.1 xFIP. Not the easiest matchup against Boston, but no Rafael Devers certainly weakens the lineup a bit. No Trevor Story weakens the lineup a bit. But he's also $9,900, which is a really expensive price tag. So to me, both of these pitchers look like they're going a bit under-owned, but also look like they're relatively unlikely to be top 2 scoring pitchers. So I don't think either one's a priority, but they are guys that, kind of like we talked about with Brady Singer, if you are going to the Dodgers, for example, then maybe consider using some, Tristan McKenzie in place of Zach Wheeler, or Cutter Crawford in place of Alex Wood, or something like that, because they are talented pitchers. It's just not ideal matchups, and in McKenzie's case, not ideal pricing. As far as the offenses go, I have a hard time liking either one too much. Cleveland is getting some ownership because they're cheap, and I think that does make sense. Ramirez and Rosario are the only expensive guys in the lineup. They're obviously good, especially Ramirez. Kwan leading off is a solid value. Naylor has power. Reyes has power. Nolan Jones is still pretty close to free. So I understand why Cleveland's pulling some ownership just from the value standpoint. You can certainly build some very solid lineups with them. And then on the other side for Boston, I think they're going a little bit under-owned, but it's still a tough spot against McKenzie. He is a boom or bust pitcher, though. 201 expected ISO to righties this year, 177 to lefties. We've seen the strikeout percentage come down a little bit this year from in the past in exchange for a lower walk percentage. So I do think that there's upside for Boston. It's not a pitcher that I look at and say, oh, yeah, McKenzie's going to get blown up, but Boston's also just not pulling much ownership.
As I look through some of the early morning data we have here, I like Cutter Crawford quite a bit for large field tournaments, because we have the Guardians as the second most negatively leveraged offense. The only team that's more negatively leveraged right now, the Los Angeles Dodgers. Fairly common when a team is picking up a third of the ownership of all the offense aggregate ownership. But so we've got the Cleveland Guardians, they're negatively leveraged. There's almost no ownership going to Cutter Crawford, which makes sense because there's so much ownership going to Cleveland. So Crawford only 5% owned on DK at $6,100. Over on FanDuel, he's projected for 1% ownership. And then you look at the strikeout numbers for Crawford this year, 27%. And he's gotten stretched out to the point where I think he's capable of working deeper into games now. So to me, this kind of checks all the boxes for what I would look for in a contrarian pitcher for large field tournaments. Finding some success, strikeout upside, not picking up ownership, going up against an offense that's owned. Does all this follow to you in terms of looking at Crawford as being a salary saving SP2?
Yeah, I think he makes sense. I don't think I get to a lot just because there's other guys that are going to just project better and be easier to get into lineups. But he is somebody that I think is kind of towards the top of the contrarian list if you're going to like the Dodgers, for example. One other thing that stands out with him, and it is a limited sample so far this year, but he's actually struck out 31.6% of lefties compared to 23.5% of righties. So Cleveland, one way or the other, is difficult to strike out, but you're going to get a left-handed heavy lineup here. He has given up power, 215 expected ISO to lefties. So kind of like the Tristan McKenzie spot, where it's just like he gives up power and he strikes out guys. And you're not getting much ownership anywhere in this game other than some ownership going to Cleveland because of how cheap they are. It just strikes me as a game where I might just end up being overweight on like everything, because I think that there's upside in the pitching, even though it's relatively difficult spots. I think there's upside in the Red Sox, even though it's not a great spot. And I think there's upside in Cleveland too, when you consider that they're inexpensive and do still have some left-handed power.
Yeah, it's an interesting game for sure. I can make a cases for a lot of different stuff. Right now, Cleveland, they are picking up a whole bunch of ownership. We'll see what that looks like later on in the day. But if you're ever stacking Cleveland, which I did this last night, I made Cleveland stacks that just didn't have Jose Ramirez in it. And the ownership, it's something that I've picked up from you because you brought it up and I've noticed it as well. oftentimes when Cleveland is popular, it's almost solely driven by Jose Ramirez, where it's like the majority of the lineup will be sub 10% owned. Then Ramirez might be projected for 25% ownership or 30% ownership on smaller slates. And that really brings up the total ownership of the team. But in terms of 5-man stacks, they're not always that well represented.
Yeah, for sure. Today they're getting a little bit more ownership just because Reyes, Jimenez, and Kwan are all double digit ownership as well. But it's still an offense that's going to be easy enough to make it somewhat contrarian. Like Ahmed Rosario is expensive, so he's only getting 7% ownership. Nolan Jones is only getting 26% ownership. This is one of the better hitting prospects in baseball. 189 ISO at AAA this year, 224 so far in the majors. Steamer projects 174 going forward. Like he's an above average hitter by every projection system. So that's somebody that at 4% ownership and a cheap price tag, you can certainly get to offset some of that other ownership. Josh Naylor is only 8%. So even though you do have guys on this team that are popular, and it's not even like you have to skip Ramirez. I mean, you can skip Jimenez and Kwan or something and go Ramirez, Reyes, Naylor, Rosario, Jones, and you have a pretty low owned stack while still playing Jose Ramirez.
Today's show, it is sponsored by Prize Picks. If you guys have not signed up for Prize Picks yet, do it using the promo code AWESEMO because it's going to get you up to $100 bonus on your first deposit. And why would you not want to start off your bankroll at a new site with some free money? So sign up using the promo code AWESEMO and check out all the different tools that we have over on the site that are going to help you build some player prop cards over on Prize Picks. Or if you're just looking to place prop bets, also look at some of the tools we have. Go on over to OddShopper, free tool to use, give you projections on all the different props that exist. One thing that really stands out to me today, just from a general perspective, Freddie Freeman is plus 450 to homer on the road in Colorado with Jose Urena as the opposing pitcher. So to me, that looks like a pretty positive ROI bet. I don't think Freddie Freeman should really ever be plus 450 at Coors Field, let alone when Jose Urena is the pitcher. So that's one bet that stands out to me early in the day. I hope that odds do not move in the next hour because I would like to include that in my betting video. So maybe wait an hour to bet it, but definitely go check out OddShopper. Look at all the different numbers we have there because it is a really useful resource when you're placing some prop bets. Moving on with the rest of the slate, Seattle Mariners against the Houston Astros. There was a point in time where Logan Gilbert looked like one of the most promising young pitchers in baseball. Last year, he was really good. He's regressed a little bit this year, and he's a tough matchup against Houston. So 4.12 expected ERA, 23.4% K rate for Logan Gilbert. He's not somebody I really ever want to stack against because I think that he's talented enough to limit the damage that opposing offenses do. But do you look at him as a potential contrarian play today? Because he does have arm talent for sure, throws the ball really hard, has some strikeout upside. It's a tough matchup, but nobody's playing him at all.
I think he's kind of similar to Tristan McKenzie, where he's going under owned, but it's also just gonna be really difficult to pay that salary. Especially because like even if you are, I'd mentioned McKenzie as somebody you could use if you're going to the Dodgers, but like the problem you're going to run into there, and it's the same thing with Gilbert, is they're relatively expensive. Like if you're looking for contrarian pitchers with the Dodgers, you're more likely to be going to like the Cutter Crawford price range. So that's going to make it difficult as well. Gilbert is good. Like I still think he's a good pitcher. He has a 3.69 xFIP so far this year, 23.5% strikeout percentage, doesn't walk a lot of guys, doesn't give up a lot of power, but from a DFS standpoint today, I think just really, really difficult to get to him against Houston. Only a 21.9% strikeout percentage against righties this year, 25.6 against lefties. Again, does a pretty good job limiting power, but Houston's a really good offense and not one that I really want to pick on with a $9,500 pitcher.
Yeah, no, I think that I don't know that Logan Gilbert is going to ultimately make it into my lineups when I build them, but when I first look at the ownership early in the morning, I think he should be more than 1% owned. His odds of being a top scoring pitcher, I do think are more than that. I don't know if that ultimately means I do end up playing him, but at the same time, I'm not interested in stacking against him with Houston either.
Yeah, I mean, like for me, I couldn't fall asleep after golf today, so after golf lock, so I ended up being a little bit more prepared for the show than normal. But like I think that on DraftKings, Logan Gilbert should, like if you're just, I'm going to use the word should. It's not the perfect word, but should be like 7% owned. But that still doesn't, I have him with a 7% chance of being optimal. So that doesn't necessarily mean he should be 7% owned. But the point is like he's getting less ownership than he deserves, but he's also just extremely unlikely to be a winning pitcher.
Yeah, and the same goes for a pitcher like Jose Urquidy, just in terms of not likely to be an optimal pitcher because he doesn't generate very many strikeouts, and he has a 4.79 expected ERA. So there's been times this year where Urquidy's been popular and I've never played him in those spots. There's the one game where he was popular and like randomly had 10 strikeouts and it was infuriating. Before today, 18.2% K rate, 4.79 expected ERA going up against the Seattle offense. That is Julio Rodriguez back, and that makes them much more potent than they were before. But Urquidy, once again for this slate, is picking up not a significant amount of ownership, but still, if you look at him, he's $8,300 projected for 8% ownership. And then over on FanDuel, he's actually $9,100 and projected for 5% ownership, which is that one's a little stranger to me. But I find it hard to back Urquidy when he's picking up any kind of ownership. Are you going to be playing him at all?
I actually think right now he looks like my favorite sub 10% guy. In the crunch or whatever you want to call it, I ran right before the show. I actually have him being in the optimal lineup about the same frequency as Jameson Taillon, and Taillon's getting more ownership. It's a spot where like I have trouble explaining why like he projects as well as he does. I don't love the matchup against Seattle. I don't love him as a pitcher. He's got about an 18% strikeout percentage this year, 4.48 xFIP. But it is a decent park to pitch in. It's not as good as Seattle, obviously, but there are some strikeouts in the Seattle lineup. If ownership holds where it is right now, I do think I end up getting quite a bit of Urquidy.
Yeah, let me look at some of the splits for Urquidy as is because off the top of my head, he has been better lately. Let me see if his strikeout rate has come up at all. July up a little bit, 22% strikeout rate in July, 3.62 FIP, 4.28 xFIP. It's obviously not the biggest sample size in the world, but for the month, he has seen a little bit of an uptick in strikeouts. That's one thing that's slightly promising. I guess I'd rather play him than a 25% owned Yusei Kikuchi, but I'm probably more inclined to just go really cheap at pitcher if I need to. And I think I'd rather get to like Cutter Crawford over Urquidy just for the $2,000 salary savings. But this could be biased on my part too, because I very rarely play Jose Urquidy and looking at the strikeout numbers. But to your point too, sometimes the projections just kind of are what they are, and you don't know why they are, and just somebody will look decent.
Yeah, and we can revisit this at the end of the show too, because I'm actually running like a legitimate dummy crunch that should be done by then, and I'll be able to say like if the slate started right now, how much Urquidy I'd have. But yeah, you mentioned Kikuchi as well. Like I have Urquidy, Taillon, and Kikuchi all more or less the same chances of being optimal. And obviously Kikuchi's pulling the most ownership, followed by Taillon, followed by Urquidy. So that's just why I think I get to a good amount of Urquidy if ownership holds how it is right now. And also, I mean, I guess worth noting, like our projection on Urquidy is in line with everything else that I've looked at today too. It's not like, you know, I don't think it's likely that we end up knocking like 3 points off of our projection or something. It's just in line with everything else. So I think that it's just a spot where I'm going to trust the computers are smarter than I am.
Yeah, which is, I think, something else that's more than reasonable. And then something else to consider too. The pitching options kind of suck over the outside of the top end guys. So if you're trying to get somewhat contrarian at pitcher, we're talking about like Jameson Taillon and Jose Urquidy. It's not like we're comparing Urquidy to some all-star caliber pitcher. And then, if the pitching's bad enough to the point where Yusei Kikuchi's projected for 25% ownership, it makes sense from that standpoint. I mean, we have Urquidy with like 50% better odds of being a top scoring pitcher on this slate compared to Kikuchi, yet Kikuchi's picking up 3x the ownership. So at the very least, I do prefer Urquidy to Kikuchi as we're talking through this.
Yeah, and a lot's going to come down to like what the rest of your lineup looks like too. I mean, Kikuchi does, I think, project a little bit better than Urquidy. So if you're playing, I was going to say the Tigers, but that would obviously be a horrible example. If you're playing a low-owned offense, like if you're playing the Red Sox or something, then I'm probably going to just be getting to more Kikuchi because he projects a little bit better, and there's no real reason for me to prefer Urquidy in those lineups. But I think Urquidy's a very strong guy to be getting to if you're going to like Dodger stacks.
All right, we've got a super chat from Dusty Hodes. He's asking, which site do you guys prefer to play on and why? So Adam's answer is going to be, I know what Adam's answer is. For me, I don't have a preference. Like to me, it's slate by slate. There's certain, I do for baseball tend to play a little bit more on DraftKings than FanDuel, but it's not something that's totally set in stone. For me, I'll just look at the pricing, the ownership projections, and sometimes it'll just be stuff that stands out to me more on FanDuel than it does on DraftKings. It's a day-to-day basis. For me, it's not just like, oh, I think X site is better than this site. I know Adam feels a little bit different about this. So Adam, why do you prefer to play on DraftKings?
So first off, I've just always run better on DraftKings. Like when I started playing, I did better there. But the main reason I play almost exclusively on DraftKings at this point is because FanDuel only lets me deposit like $5,000 a month, and it just ends up not being worth my time to play one slate. And then if I don't win, I'm done for the month. So that's the biggest reason, is that Maryland has deposit restrictions and sites have discretion to up them for individual people. And DraftKings discretion allowed me 6 times what FanDuel did. So yeah, it's just a lot easier for me to play on DraftKings money wise. But yeah, also, I mean, I think that I like the tournaments better on DraftKings these days. Like you're typically getting 25K to first on FanDuel compared to 50 or 100 on DraftKings. But yeah, I mean, mostly like I would for sure just play both sites if I could just get as much money as I wanted on FanDuel. But if I had to pick one, like I would still just pick DraftKings because the tournaments pay out more.
Yeah, no, it's if I could only play on one side, I would prefer DraftKings, but I'll say this to people all the time, and this especially goes for sports betting. I know this is not an answer a lot of people like to hear, but you really should be going to as many different sites as possible. And this is especially true for something like sports betting. Not that this is your, I know this isn't related to your question, Dusty, but for sports betting, number one, if you sign up at a bunch of different books, they give you sign up bonuses. Like if they're just going to give you free money for signing up, like you might as well take advantage of it. And then also, if you look at Odd Shopper, where we have our tools to compare lines at different books, like I mentioned before, I think at first glance, it's pretty appealing that Freddie Freeman is plus 450 to homer. But with that said, he's not plus 450 to homer on every book. And why would I bet him at plus 250 to homer at one spot when I could bet him at plus 450 anywhere else? So, especially when it comes to sports betting, you'll just see like odd shopping, line shopping is going to give you considerably better odds and make you much more profitable in the long term because different books offer different odds. But
yeah, and I mean that concept does go to DFS as well, and it's why if like I would play both sites, even though I just hate everything about FanDuel anyway. Like you're naturally, the more sites you're playing in DFS, it's kind of like shopping lines. Like you're just naturally going to get hedges against yourself because you're playing, ownership and pricing is such a big part of DFS. And it's inherently going to be different between the sites. So like, there's just going to be a lot of times in tournaments where it's just like, oh, on DraftKings, I played the Dodgers, the Yankees, and the Braves. And on FanDuel, I played the Cubs, the Rangers, and the Phillies. And you just end up kind of hedging against yourself across different sites.
yeah, and I mean, we'll see that too. If I just look at the top stacks tool, for instance, right now, a team like the Yankees, for instance, are 2% owned on DraftKings, but they're 6% owned on FanDuel. So there's a much different outlook for that stack. And that happens pretty frequently across FanDuel and DraftKings, where one team might be 18% owned on one slate and 12% owned on another slate. And as a result, they'll be positively leveraged one place, negatively leveraged another place. So it's just a way to differentiate your portfolio. I know that Dusty wanted well, I'm assuming anyway, that he wanted a definitive answer. Like this is the place you go to make the most money. But the reality is that's not really what the answer is. And there could also be something you just like better about a different site. For whatever reason, you might find out you track your results and you might be way better at Yahoo than you are at FanDuel or way better at one site than another. If you find that over a long period of time tracking your results, then just play where you make money.
And one thing I will say positive about FanDuel, it depends what contest you're playing too. If you're like trying to grind up a bankroll playing cash games, and you're only going to play one site, I would play FanDuel because they have such good single entry 100-man 50-50s. They have the 100-mans that fill frequently where it's, like top 12 get paid and you can, make pretty decent money in those. So yeah, like I was talking about preferring DraftKings contests for large field tournaments. If you're grinding like 50-50s and stuff, I would prioritize FanDuel.
Yeah, and then sorry, didn't mean to make this such a long answer. One other thing I would say, if you're trying to get into 150 maxing, FanDuel, if you're not limited in playing the low dollar contest, I'm going to pull up the FanDuel lobby right now. They have really low buy-in 150 max tournaments. Like how often, Adam, will one of us post a screenshot or something on Twitter and people are like, "Oh, you did 150 lineups. I can't afford to play 150 lineups." FanDuel has a 5-cent 150 max tournament. You could afford to play 150 lineups you're playing over on FanDuel. It's 5 cents to enter. So if you do think that 150 lineups is something you want to do, but you just don't really know the right way to experiment it, go do it over on FanDuel and play what is that, $7 if you're playing 150 lineups. Like it's a really, really low really low entry points when they have 25 cent and 5 cent 150 max tournaments.
Do you know what the lowest even is on DraftKings these days? Like $1?
For 150 max,
Yeah.
I think 50 cents is the lowest,
Okay.
which also isn't that much. But
Yeah,
I mean,
no,
this
but
is
I mean,
even
still 10
considerably
times,
lower. Yeah.
10 times FanDuel.
Yeah. So there's different things to like about different sites. Depends on what your goals are and what you're trying to do. But yeah, also if you want more information on that, Dusty, because I don't want this to take up the entire show, DM me on Twitter and we could talk about it also. Next game we have to talk about here, it's a biggie. The Los Angeles Dodgers against the Colorado Rockies. The Dodgers implied team total, nearly 7.5 runs. They are expected to score a whole bunch today because they are on the road. They're in Coors Field, which is always a benefit. And then they're also going up against Jose Urena. Now, the last time they went up against Jose Urena in Coors Field, they didn't put up runs, but Urena also got incredibly lucky. He had 2 strikeouts and 3 walks against the Dodgers at Coors Field. More often than not, that is going to yield a lot of runs. But baseball, it is random. Weird shit happens. And that was just not the Dodgers' night. If you're playing in cash games today, you are playing the Dodgers as much as you can. No second thoughts about it. But in tournaments, how are you going to handle them, Adam, when they're projected to be in about a third of the field's lineups?
Yeah, I think it's obviously tricky in tournaments. I will say that I have them. So like what the numbers I'm referring to are a little bit different than the top stacks tool, just because it combines the top value percentage and top stack percentage. I have them being optimal like around 20% of the time, which is twice as often as the next closest team for me. In the top stacks tool, we have them being the top stack almost 3 times as frequently as the next closest team. So they look really good against Urania. He's in a limited sample so far this year, 177 expected ISO to lefties, 200 to righties. He's been pretty lucky so far. I expect that to not continue. He's not striking guys out. So it really just comes down to, and I'm interested to see kind of how it looks for me by the end of the show. I think there's a good chance because pitching is so concentrated today that I end up still playing the Dodgers a good amount, but more so in like 3-mans, 2-man, stuff like that, and then just getting to the good pitching. But I also think you can make a case for just like playing a lot of Dodgers and then taking shots on the low end pitching like Crawford.
Yeah, that's where I'm at too. And if I do end up going with Dodger stacks today, which I'm more inclined to go underweight to them, but I haven't made up my mind yet exactly what I would do. But Cutter Crawford, like that, those are the types of pitchers I would look at, or maybe like Urquidy, who we talked through before. If you get those low-owned pitchers, it doesn't matter what you're doing with the Dodgers offense, because sure, the offense is going to be popular, but the lineup is still different if you're playing, 8 and 1% owned pitchers. So there are going to be ways to differentiate them. But I don't really know what else there is to say about the Dodgers. Other than this is clearly the offense that's in the best spot on the slate. You're just wrestling with ownership.
Yeah, and the thing that's really difficult, and it goes back to what you were talking about with Cleveland. Not only are the Dodgers popular, the lowest owned guy on this team right now is Justin Turner at 15.5%. So it's not like you're saying, oh, this team's popular, but I can throw in 1 or 2 sub 10% owned guys in my 5-man stack. If you 5-man stack this team, you are legitimately just playing 5 guys that are rostered by anywhere between like 1/8 and 1/3 of the field. So it's really difficult to make contrarian lineups if you do that. That being said, you can pair the Dodgers with the Tigers. You can pair them with some other low-owned team. You can use, play Urquidy alongside Crawford or something like that. But it is typically, obviously it's not cut and dry. Like I do it all the time, but typically for me, I'm more willing to just go heavy on chalk pitching and spread it out with offenses because 1, there's just more variance in offenses. And then 2, when you talk about chalk pitching, you're taking up 1 or 2 spots in your lineup. When you talk about bats, you're taking up half of your lineup. So it just becomes a little bit more difficult to be different.
Yeah, and we've got some people in the chat are saying, well, the Dodgers, Urania pitched well against them. Don't get caught up in looking at earned runs. He pitched 6 innings, gave up 1 run, but he had 2 strikeouts and 3 walks. Not that individually XFIP is a great barometer to look at, but he had a 5.88 XFIP in that game. The reality is if you pitch against the Dodgers and you walk more hitters than you strike out, you probably didn't pitch well. If you didn't give up runs, you got lucky more than anything. And Urania is not a pitcher that I have any kind of confidence in, especially not at Coors Field. If you're not playing the Dodgers today, you shouldn't be doing it because you think Urania is good against the Dodgers. You're doing it because you think the Dodgers are too popular.
Yeah, and also, I mean, even if Urania could have gone 7 innings, struck out 14 guys, in that game. And I would still say the Dodgers are very, very clearly the top stack. Like, I could not care less what happens in one game. If you're not playing the Dodgers today, it's not, or it shouldn't be, because you are saying, oh, the Dodgers aren't going to do well. Like, I've talked about this before. Like, you need to think in terms of range of outcomes and not try and just like guess what's going to happen in baseball games, because you're going to be wrong. Everybody is, no matter how good you are, wrong constantly on that. With the Dodgers, it's just, if you're not playing them, you're saying, I hope I get lucky and they don't do what they're like. If you played this game 1,000 times, they are lighting up Urania the majority of the time. But you're talking about a 1 game sample size where they're 30-something% owned. So if you're not playing them, you're just saying like, okay, I hope I get lucky and they just hit a bunch of line drives at people or something and they only score 3 or 4 runs and a third of the field loses. You're not saying, like, oh, everybody's wrong, the Dodgers are actually not in a good spot against Jose Urania in Coors Field.
Yeah, it's a good spot. It doesn't mean that they're guaranteed to do well or not, but they're very popular for a reason. There's a reason their implied team total is like 7.5 runs. It's one of the highest marks we've seen of the entire season. It's clearly a good spot for them. But then on the other side, Tyler Anderson's pitched fairly well. Previously a pitcher for the Colorado Rockies, but now he's gotten himself out of Colorado. He's found success in other places, and especially this year. 3.04 expected ERA, 21.2% K rate. What do you make of the matchup between Tyler Anderson and the Rockies offense? Rockies better against left-handed pitching than right-hand pitching, but it's also Coors Field. Tyler Anderson's had success. There's a lot going on in this matchup.
Yeah, I mean, I still just don't think I end up getting to Anderson. You're not really getting you're not getting a discount. He's 9,100. He's in Coors. The Rockies this year at home have like a 175 to 180 ISO, 103, I think, WRC plus. I'm not looking at it right now, but I know I looked a couple of days ago. They're just obviously better at home as usual. They strike out around 21% of the time, give or take. So it's just really tough for me to want to get to Anderson here in Colorado.
And then with the Colorado Rockies as a stack, they're not picking up that much ownership. And typically that's kind of appealing to me at Coors Field. But considering the high ground ball rate of Tyler Anderson, I don't know that this is the most appealing spot for me to get to them, even at 4.5% ownership.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, whenever the Rockies aren't pulling ownership in Coors, I am somewhat interested. Anderson is a pitcher that I have plenty of respect for, but it is still Coors Field. But only a 138 expected ISO to righties this year for Anderson. So if you're getting to some relatively low-owned, Chris Bryant, CJ Crow, and Brendan Rodgers, that's all fine, but tough to be really confident in them.
All right. So from the most popular offense on the slate to the most popular pitcher on the slate by a mile, Shohei Ohtani is pitching at home against the Texas Rangers. Ohtani is here, 2.47 expected ERA, 35.9% K rate. I never thought this would have been the case after last year, but Ohtani's been better as a pitcher than a hitter this year and has arguably been the best pitcher in the American League over the last couple of months. And it's funny, if you look at his last game, I'd say like, oh, he gave up 6 runs. He was lights out in that last start, and then they just left him in forever to the point where he's out there towards the end of the game. And something else that I think kind of weighs on Ohtani, their offense sucks so bad that I think he knows that if he gives up any runs as a pitcher, they're not winning the game. So I think he really puts a lot of pressure on himself in high leverage situations to jack up his fastball to be 100 plus miles per hour because he just can't allow any runs. And as a result, he gassed in the 6th inning of his last start, and they just left him out there to just get torched. So he might have given up 6 runs, but still because of the strikeouts, he had a good fantasy outing. But I really do think that he is a pitcher who's been relatively unblemished over his last whatever starts of outings now. But with the really high strikeout rate, also, what we really have to consider here, Adam, is does he warrant having 66% ownership on DraftKings or nearly 40% ownership on FanDuel on an 8-game slate?
So I just finished the crunch that I was doing, and if the slate started right now, I'd have 100% Ohtani on DraftKings. He's mispriced. This isn't a particularly strong pitching slate. He has the highest strikeout percentage by nearly 10 points, 35.9% strikeout percentage this year for Ohtani, 26.7% for Wheeler, who is second, 2.38 xFIP for Ohtani, hasn't given up power, 115 expected ISO to lefties, sub 100 to righties, 33.5% strikeout percentage against lefties, 38% against righties. I just have no argument against Shohei Ohtani here. He's pitching in LA. It's supposed to be like 75 degrees. Everything looks great.
I think the DraftKings pricing algorithm is messed up by his hitting stats. Like, we know there's something missing here because they can't figure out how to make him a hitter and a pitcher at the same time. But as good as he's been as a pitcher, Has he been priced remotely correctly at all as of late?
No, I don't remember the last time Otani was priced correctly. I'm not sure if it's happened this season.
Which is why I think that it has to be his hitting stats that are messing up the pricing algorithm in some way. Because FanDuel has it right. FanDuel has him priced all the way up to 11,100. Like, if he was that price, I think we'd have more of a discussion point over on DraftKings, but we don't because he's $8,900 as the clear top pitcher on the slate. If you look at our tools, his odds of being the top scoring pitcher today, it is nearly double Zach Wheeler, who is the second best odds. So there's nobody remotely close to him today, and he's $8,900 on DraftKings. He's going to be popular, but it's way easier for me to stomach pitch chalk ownership than it is some of the crazy high offense ownership. There's just a lot more stability with Shohei Ohtani, and I'll go through some of his game logs just to prove a point here. Otani's recent starts, it would be easier if DraftKings didn't have all these games just sorted by his offense and uh, pitching stats together. But he's been at least around 20 fantasy points in all of his starts for the last 2 months. You're just not going to get that stability of chalk at any other pitcher in baseball.
Yeah, exactly. It's still baseball. Like, can he have a bad start? Sure. Sean V apparently or said that apparently he pitched poorly against Texas last time that he was chalk. Again, very high on the list of things that I could not care less about. But clearly, like, it's baseball, he can do poorly, but you have to make lineups, and you can't just point to every single player and say, oh, well, this guy's probably or might not do well, because yeah, that's true, but it applies to everybody. So it's just a complete mispricing. I don't like really any of the other pitching. I mean, I like Alex Wood, I like Zach Wheeler, but not to the same extent that I like Otani. They're not the same level of pitcher. I'm gonna just end up playing a ton of Otani, and even right now. So looking at the lineups I built, I got around the field on the Dodgers and have 100% Otani. So it kind of tells me that it wasn't that difficult for me to make lineups that, they're obviously not crazy off the board, but kind of looking through some of my top lineups, Otani or Urquidy with a Dodger stack, that like a Dodgers Red Sox stack, or a Red Sox Dodger stack, 5 Red Sox, 3 Dodgers. Otani or Urquidy with the Phillies and the Red Sox. Just stuff. It's not difficult to still get some Dodgers mixed in, get Otani lineups, and then go to some of these other teams that are low enough owned where I still have lineups that are contrarian enough for me.
And by the way, it's not like his last start against the Rangers wasn't his best start of the year, but he pitched 6 innings, had 7 strikeouts, and gave up 2 runs. Like, that's not a disaster by any standpoint. And do you know how long you have to go back to find a start where Otani didn't have double-digit strikeouts? June 16th. It's been nearly a month and a half since Otani had less than 10 strikeouts in a game. So the stuff's been ridiculous as of late. The most likely scenario here is that he is one of the, if not the top highest scoring pitcher on the slate, and he just is underpriced on DraftKings. So I'm going to be playing Otani. If you guys aren't playing Otani for ownership reasons, he's going to be in 2/3 of the field's lineups on DraftKings. He's going to be in 40% of the field's lineups on FanDuel on a single pitcher site. So for ownership reasons, you could go elsewhere. I don't think I'm going to, though. I'll just play the chalk Otani, and I'll try to get contrarian elsewhere. Starting for the Texas Rangers, Spencer Howard is on the mound, and he showed some strikeout upside in the minor leagues. It just hasn't been there at the big league level this year. He's also gotten hit really hard, but he's got a matchup against this terrible Angels lineup that seemingly can't hit any starting pitcher. So Spencer Howard, he sucks. The Angels offense, they suck. But which side do you think might suck a little bit less?
I'm gonna have some Howard just because he's 5,200 facing the Angels, and supposedly at some point was good at throwing baseballs, and that's kind of all that you need against the Angels. I'm not going crazy with it though. Like right now, if the slate started, I'd have 6 or 7%. That's more than I have of the Angels because you can't roster Otani, so it's still just pretty difficult to like the Angels. I do think the price tags on like Taylor Ward, Jared Walsh, Max Stassi, Joe Adell are pretty appealing because they're so cheap, but they're also not very good.
All right, one game left to talk about today. Do us a favor, guys. Like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, check out all the other content that we have today. We've got the MMA Strategy Show, MLB Deeper Dive, MLB Live Before Lock. So later on in the day, we're going to be breaking down all of the slate again, but with more updated information in terms of anything that might happen with ownership and whatnot, lineups coming out later in the day. So check all that out as well. But closing out the slate, it's the San Francisco Giants at home against the Chicago Cubs. Alex Wood, he's been solid this year with a 3.68 expected ERA and a 24.3% K rate. He's also in a pitcher-friendly park. He's going up against the Chicago Cubs offense that is not all that great. And another pitcher in Alex Wood who's just underpriced. He's $7,500 on DK, $8,400 on FanDuel. Kind of hard to avoid him at those kind of salaries.
Yeah, it's just a really good price tag. It's a good park to pitch in. There are strikeouts in the Cubs lineup. As of right now, they still have Wilson Contreras and Ian Happ. If one of them were to get traded today, that would make the lineup even better. But assuming they're going to be in, I mean, Wood just looks really good. It's a $7,500 price tag on a slate where there are a lot of bats that we want to pay for, where there's not a lot of mid-range pitching that we can feel comfortable in or comfortable with. 24% strikeout percentage for Wood, 3.13 xFIP is actually the third best on the slate behind only Ohtani and Wheeler. Right now I'm getting right around the field on him, around 30%. But yeah, he looks really good. And again, I think he's the guy that I'm most likely to pair with Ohtani and Cash.
And then as for the pitching for the Chicago Cubs, it's Justin Steele on the mound. He's been very mediocre this year, 3.74 expected ERA, 21.1% K rate. It's the same thing. It comes to the Giants a lot, though. Number one, they pinch hit a ton. That's a real pain in the ass. And when they're at home, it's also a pretty pitcher friendly ballpark. So I don't really see myself all that inclined to get to Steele nor the Giants offense. But is there anything that really stands out to you in this spot?
No, that's the same boat for me. Right now, I'm not getting to the Giants, and I'm not really getting to much Steele. Got like 4 or 5%, which tells me he's just somebody that I'm mixing into. If I have a Dodger stack with Ohtani, Justin Steele's a good SP too. If I have like a Red Sox Phillies stack, there's no real reason for me to be getting the Steele. He has been a good pitcher this year, but his strikeout percentage splits are pretty drastic, and we can assume that the Giants are going to run out a right-handed heavy lineup. Only an 18.7% strikeout percentage against righties for Steele this year, compared to 28.7% against lefties. He has been extremely good at limiting power to both sides. 104 expected ISO to right-handed hitters is obviously really good. So it's not a spot where I'm really looking to target against him with the Giants, but outside of individual lineups where I'm just throwing a random low-owned pitcher that has some semblance of ability into the lineup, I don't see myself getting too much of Steele either.
All right. So that is going to do it for us today, guys. Like I said, check out all the rest of the content we have on the channel today. Also, like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Other than that, shout out to Prize Picks for sponsoring the show. Good luck today, guys, and I'll see you later on tonight's show.